Hey everyone! So today we're going to touch on a topic about how God chooses to work redemption. So if you've been reading with us through the Bible, you know that we've been pretty busy lately. We have finished up with the book of Joshua, and then we headed into the book of Judges, which was pretty tough and disturbing. And then for a breath of fresh air, we read the book of Ruth, and now we are into 1 Samuel. And so throughout these books, we've seen different vignettes or little stories of individuals walking through this season of Israel's history. And these stories, they serve a lot of different purposes, but one of them is to depict the current state of Israel at this time. And so as we see from Judges, there's just this continual degradation of the integrity of the leaders and of the actions of the people in Israel, and it gets pretty disturbing toward the end. And then we read Ruth, which is, like I said, a breath of fresh air for us. But as we read the book of Ruth, which is set in a similar time period as the book of Judges, we see that in the midst of all the corruption that's happening in Israel, God is behind the scenes working out a plan of redemption for his child, Israel. And so that's what struck me as I was reading through these books is three particular vignettes about how God chose to work with people to bring about his plan of redemption, but it's a specific type of people that he chose to do this through, and that is through the weak. God in these books, he isn't working through working alone and just doing divine miracle after divine miracle after divine miracle, but as people, he works through the people who are weak and bring that weakness to him. So I'm just going to go through super quickly some stories that we've read through to depict this, and then hopefully I'll be able to summarize it pretty quickly. So the first story that stood out to me was in Judges chapter 6, 7, and 8. We have the story of Gideon. And so the Israelites, right, they were being oppressed by the Midianites because they had been unfaithful to God. And then they cried out to God for help. And God he comes to help, but he does it by sending an angel to this guy named Gideon and saying, hey, rise up, you mighty warrior, and come and defeat the Midianites. And interestingly, Gideon's response, so Gideon at that point, he's hiding in a wine press, threshing wheat there as opposed to out in the open like normal. So he's hiding, and his response is like, who me? I'm of the weakest clan in the tribe of Manasseh, and I'm the least of my father's house. So he has this weakness that he brings before the angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord's response is, all right, go in this might of yours and defeat the Midianites. And as I was reading through this, I was struck by what might is the angel of the Lord talking about. And I think it's Gideon's acknowledgement of his weakness. And hopefully we'll see why. And so the story unfolds, and Gideon is faithful to God's call to stand up and rise up against the Midianites. God chooses to dwindle the size of the army, so it's only 300 men, so that they defeat the Midianites, but the Israelites can't claim that it was because of their own strength, but they have to claim that it was because of God's. And then we come into the book of Ruth. And this is just a beautiful story that there's so much to say about. But Ruth is a Moabite. She's a foreigner. And for several reasons, she journeys to Israel with her widowed mother-in-law. And Ruth decided to go to Israel with her mother-in-law to be faithful to her and to love her. She didn't have to go. And this seems compassionate and it seems faithful and sweet and whatever, but when we understand the context of Israel, we realize that it's also really brave of her. As a Moabite, Ruth could have been killed, and she goes out gleaning in the fields, getting the leftover food from other people's fields to feed herself and to feed her mother-in-law, and that's a place where she could have been killed and she could have been raped. but she does it out of faithful love and obedience toward her mother-in-law. And as the story unfolds, we see that Ruth is acknowledged by a man named Boaz for her faithful compassion and courage, and he ends up redeeming her and marrying her, and she becomes the mother of Obed, who becomes the father of Jesse, who becomes the father of David, who becomes a great king, the greatest king in all of Israel's history. And later down that lineage comes Jesus. And so Ruth, this exiled, or not exiled, marginalized Moabite, who would have been cast out of society in general, God chose to put his favor on her, not just in the midst of her lifetime in Israel, but throughout her generations in a way that she couldn't have seen. And then we come to the story of 1 Samuel, and in the first chapter we see a woman named Hannah who is unable to have children, which is a big deal in Israel. The glory of women really was to be able to get married and then to have children. And Hannah, because of her barrenness, she is mocked by her husband's other wife, and she's mocked every time she goes up to the temple of the Lord. And I just read this story, and I imagine myself being Hannah and thinking, wow, if I was her, I would believe that I was unable to, that God was holding out on me because I had done something wrong, that there was something that I needed to be ashamed of, and I would feel like he wasn't giving me the best gift ever. I would have been tempted like Eve in the garden to believe that God was withholding something from me. But Hannah's response, instead of becoming resentful or angry and turning away from God like most of the rest of Israel was doing at that point, her response was to go to the temple of the Lord and pour out her heart to God, including her vexation, and just pour it out to him, to turn to him, and to be faithful to him. And in response, God gives her a son who becomes a great judge in Israel. And so what do we learn from these stories? Well, one of the things, I guess the main thing really, is that God is the God of the weak, of the oppressed, of the fatherless, of the widow, of the orphans. He cares for those who are brokenhearted. That's where his heartbeat is at. And so, I guess, like, God doesn't just look at someone who's weak, and then if the person is weak and they complain and whatever, God honors them. But all these people, in their weakness, they brought it to God. They acknowledged their weakness before God, and God basically said, perfect, I'm going to use that for my strength. And so in the book of, is it 1st or 2nd Corinthians 12? I think 2nd Corinthians 12, in the New Testament, Paul talks about, when I am weak, I am strong. I've learned to boast all the more in my weaknesses so that the power of Christ might rest on me. And I always used to take that verse, when I'm weak, then I'm strong, to be like, I'm going to immediately become strong. And so I would do things like, if I had a headache or I hadn't slept really well, but I had a commitment the next day, I would pray about it and be like, God, make the tiredness go away, make the headache go away. And if it didn't go away, I would abandon and cancel, my appointment or something like that. And over time in reading scripture, I realized that that's not how God works. God didn't say when, in Isaiah 43 or whatever, when you walk through, if you run away from the fires, I'll be with you. If you run away from, the rivers, I'll be with you. He said, when you walk through the fires, you will not be burned. When you walk through the rivers, I won't let them overtake you. And so God's call for us in our weakness is not to run away from our responsibility and stop being faithful to the things that he calls us to, but to continue being faithful. And so my failures before were to not let my yes be yes, and also to do a lot of complaining, which we're also not necessarily called to do. And as I've grown in taking the times that I'm weak, and I am become faithful to God, like we saw Gideon do and Ruth do and Hannah do, I've seen God work incredible things for His glory. And I'm learning that in presenting my weakness to God, in pouring out my heart to Him in my weakness, and in being faithful as best I know how at that moment to His Word, that incredibly powerful things happen. Yeah, and so I see this, in the story of Ruth, just for example, just Ruth taking her weakness and being a foreigner and turning to God and just being faithful and brave and self-sacrificing, loving, compassionate, all of these things. And God uses it to honor her in ways that she can't even imagine or see at that moment. And that's what happens when we give God our weaknesses. There are some times where He responds in an immediate way, and you're like, wow, that was awesome. Thank you, God. But I think more often when we turn our weaknesses to God continually over and over again, we get to see 5 or 10 years or 30 years later or generations later how God used that together to glorify and magnify His name. And I see that in my life, that it was my struggles with anxiety and depression that led me to come to faith in Jesus. It was the fact that I was stuck in a wheelchair this past summer, that I'm no longer working with disabled children, but I know that I'm that I found out that God has called me into ministry. And it's the people who I've seen suffer far more than I have ever been able to, who have this radiance and strength just coming out of them, that is not of any earthly power, but that is Christ's power resting on them. And so this is just an encouragement and a call towards you to embrace your weaknesses, but also to remain faithful to God in your weaknesses, because you can be like Gideon, you can be like Ruth, you can be like Hannah, and you can radiate the power of Christ if you offer your weakness as a living sacrifice. Thank you guys, and have an awesome week.